Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Mr. Mendelsohn. Welcome, Mr. Zeeman at the John Adams Institute. Mr. Mendelsohn, the John Adams Institute is very honored to have you here tonight, and I would like to congratulate you with the Dutch translation of your book, The Lost, a search for 6 of 6 million, translated into Dutch by the Arbeiderspers, and a copy of the Dutch translation is available here tonight at the back of this auditorium. Mr. Mendelsohn fits into a tradition of Jewish writers the John Adams Institute had the honor to welcome at its stage in the past. We had authors like Chaim Potok, Saul Bellow, Michael Chabon, Jonathan Safran Foer, and Nathan Englander, though these are all fiction writers. The Lost has won the National Books Critical Circle Award, is on the New York Times bestseller list, and got raving reviews also in the Netherlands in NRC Handelsblad, and I think also in the Volkskrant. So I'm very proud to have you here tonight. And Mr. Zeeman is our moderator for tonight. He's an author and a critic, and he will introduce Mr. Mendelsohn and his work. May I ask you to introduce him?
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, Mr. Daniel Mendelsohn wrote his book in a tradition, but don't be mistaken for what tradition it is. Is er een probleem met het geluid? Okay. This is a book about a search for 6 of the 6 million, as the subtitle has it. But this is not a book in the long line of either Holocaust memories or attempts to find the reality back behind that immense dramatic epoch of European history, because it is a far more complicated book. It is a book that is, I think, far more ambitious and much deeper than what you would expect if you associate it with that general trend in literary fiction or literary non-fiction of the last decades. And I shall try to explain why this is no ordinary book. You should close your ears because this is going to be very embarrassing for you. And I do that by turning around how the architecture of the book develops itself. Of course, this is the book of a man in America who lives in a secularized Jewish family and a large extended family, who from his earliest youth onwards hears either whispered or in tears or in complaints or in large words the stories about how it went in Europe and how one member of the family of his grandfather with his family, his children, disappeared during the Holocaust. Of course, that story is present, and how the boy growing up gets intrigued by that history, wants to know every single detail, both about what happened and about the response of his family. But there is much more to it. And in order to explain that, I shall turn the architecture around. The most striking stylistic, or should I say rhetorical element of the book is that the continuing narrative often is interchanged with fragments of theology, fragments of the first verses and the first chapters of the Torah book, the Bible book Genesis, which are analyzed and commented upon in a strong philological tradition. Now we all know that all good theology is great philology. And in the biblical philology, God is indeed in the detail. Even one misspelling or false letter in the printed version of the Torah makes the sacred book subject to great theological discussions. So what we see here is the writer studying and analyzing the oldest texts of Jewish religion and culture meticulously as a great philologist, in order to understand the history he is dealing with. He is passing the two histories, crossing them, as it were, on each other. That is the structure of the book. The second layer is the quest for what happened. The tour around the globe to find survivors of the very little market town in Galicia in which his family lived, the author's family lived, the few Jewish survivors who survived the Aktion in 1941 when the Jewish population of that village was annihilated. That is a tour around the globe. It brings him to many countries and continents, and very carefully he finds the tiny pieces of the witnesses in order to restore an answer to the question what actually happened. He describes his tour because looking for the answer is not only looking for the answer to the question what happened then and there, but also part of the answer to the question, who am I amidst all those people? What is my relationship with history in a larger sense? What is my relationship with the culture in which I was brought up? So the history has two faces. It is history as it is written, and history as it exists, as it was in reality the story of people, the fate of people. And then, of course, we have the story, the tiny pieces of what happened to those people, the reality, the realia of that history, and the difficulty, the immense difficulty of knowing what actually happened. So what you get is facts insofar as you can trace them, the way in which you trace them and what they can mean for you, and the attempt to place them in the perspective of a much longer history. This provokes a reading of the book that goes much further than the narrative or anecdotal reading. It is an appeal to the reader himself. What is his relationship with history? What is his relationship with this history? What, by the end of the day, is his identity before he started reading the book and after he finished it? Are the questions not that intriguing that indeed something happened to him? There are a lot of questions to be asked to the author. I have the great privilege of doing that in a few minutes before you as an audience. Before we start with our interview here, Daniel Mendelsohn will read a few fragments from his book. After we have done our part of the conversation at the table, I of course will invite you to ask what you want to know or to comment. Thank you. Daniel, may I invite you?
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like I'm going to move to Europe tomorrow. It doesn't get better than this. What I want to do is, I'm just going to read a little bit from the book so you have a sort of flavor of the book. And as I don't need to tell you, my interlocutor is so interesting that why waste time on me? I think we should just get to him. And so I'm eager to get into this conversation with him because we had such an interesting talk before that I'm eager to get back to it. But what I'm going to do is just read to you from the very beginning of the book. So I don't need to tell you anything. I don't need to set it up because it's the first pages, and then sort of very briefly go from that and just explain to you or describe to you some of what was the process by which I came to write the book and why this structure that was just so brilliantly described to you was the structure that I chose. But I think I'm just going to start. And the only thing that you need to know for this beginning segment is that I had a great uncle, the brother of my grandfather, who perished along with his wife and their 4 teenage daughters in a small town in Poland. And his name was Shmuel, which is the Yiddish nickname for Samuel. Some time ago, when I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, it would occasionally happen that I'd walk into a room and certain people would begin to cry. The rooms in which this happened were located, more often than not, in Miami Beach, Florida. And the people on whom I had this strange effect were, like nearly everyone else in Miami Beach, Florida in the mid-1960s, old. Like nearly everyone else in Miami Beach at that time, or so it seemed to me then, these old people were Jews. Jews of the sort who were likely to lapse when sharing prized bits of gossip or coming to the long-delayed endings of stories or to the punchlines of jokes into Yiddish, which of course had the effect of rendering the climaxes, the points of these stories and jokes, incomprehensible to those of us who were young. Like many elderly residents in Miami Beach in those days, these old people lived in apartments or small houses that seemed, to those who did not live in them, slightly stale, and which were, on the whole, quiet, except on those evenings when the sound of the Red Skelton or Milton Berle or Lawrence Welk shows blared from the black and white television sets. At certain intervals, however, their stale and quiet apartments would grow noisy with the voices of young children who had flown down for a few weeks in the winter or spring from Long Island or from the New Jersey suburbs to see these old Jews, and who would be presented to them squirming with awkwardness and embarrassment and forced to kiss their papery, cool cheeks. Kissing the cheeks of old Jewish relatives. We writhed, we groaned, we wanted to race down to the kidney-shaped heated swimming pool in back of the apartment complex, but first we had to kiss all those cheeks, which, on the men, smelled like basements and hair tonic and Tiparillos, and were scratchy with whiskers so white you'd often mistake them for lint, as my younger brother once did, who attempted to pluck off the offending fluff only to be smacked ungently on the side of the head. And on the old women gave off the vague aroma of face powder and cooking oil, and were as soft as the emergency tissues crammed into the bottoms of their purses, crushed there like petals next to the violet-smelling salts, wrinkled cough drop wrappers, and crumpled bills. Of those old men and women who would sometimes cry at the mere sight of me, those old Jewish people with the cheeks that had to be kissed, with their faux alligator wristwatch bands and dirty Yiddish jokes, and thick black plastic glasses with the yellowed plastic hearing aids trailing off the back, with the glasses brimful of whiskey, with the pencils that they'd offer you each time you saw them, which bore the names of banks and car dealerships, with their A-line cotton print dresses and triple strands of white plastic beads and pale crystal earrings and the red nail varnish that glittered and clicked on their long, long nails as they played mahjong and canasta or clutched the long, long cigarettes that they'd smoke. Of those, the ones I could make cry had certain other things in common. They all spoke with a particular accent, one with which I was familiar because it was the accent that haunted, faintly but perceptibly, my grandfather's speech. Not too heavy, since by the time I was old enough to notice such thing, they had lived here in America for half a century, but still there was a telltale ripeness, a plummy quality to certain words that had lots of R's and L's, words like darling and wonderful, a certain way of biting into the T's and TH's in words like terrible, and a word my grandfather, who liked to tell stories, often used, truth. It's the truth, he would say. These elderly Jews tended to interrupt one another a lot on those occasions when they and we would all crowd into somebody's musty living room, cutting off one another's stories to make corrections, reminding one another what had really happened at this or that wonderful, or more likely, terrible time Darling, I was there, I remember, and I'm telling you it's the truth. Among these people, there were some who cried when they saw me. I would walk into the room, and they would look at me, and mostly the women, they would put both twisted hands with the rings and the knots swollen and hard like those of a tree that were their knuckles. They would put these hands to their dry cheeks and say with a stagey little indrawn breath, "Euer zet euch sehr ähnlich zu Schmiel." Oh, he looks so much like Schmiel. And then they would start crying, or exclaiming softly and rocking back and forth with their pink sweaters or windbreakers shaking around their loose shoulders. And there would then begin a good deal of rapid-fire Yiddish from which I was then excluded. Thanks. Thank you. So I just wanted to give you a sort of sense of what the book is because to me, and this may sound like a peculiar thing to say, this is not a book about the Holocaust. This is a book about a family, and all my impulse to tell the story that is told in the book, which of course has the Holocaust in it, derived from coming from a very idiosyncratic family. And basically, what happened is this. And now I'm going to talk very fast because I'm terrified that that schedule is going to come back over my head and I'm going to be behind. Okay, so here's how it went. What really happened was this. When I was growing up, I felt, of course, because of the story I've just told you, implicated, I don't know how else to describe it, in the story of this man who was killed. You know, even before I knew what the Holocaust was, I was being told that I evoked this other person, which is a very peculiar thing to be told when you're a child. You know, I'm sure this is true of all cultures, but I only know Jewish culture, and, you know, typically when you're a small child going into a room of old Jewish ladies, what happens is not that they burst into tears and run for the exit. And you know, all my brothers and sisters were being pinched on the cheeks and given candy, and everybody would burst into tears when they saw me. So I felt somehow connected to the story before I understood what it meant. Now, the other thing that you need to know is that I had this amazing grandfather who was born at the turn of the last century in this little town of what I call Bolachov, which is the incorrect Yiddish pronunciation, and came as an adult to the United States with his other brothers and sisters in the 1920s, leaving behind this one brother, Uncle Shmuel. Now, the thing that's important to know about my grandfather is that he was, and everybody knew this, and everyone said it, including himself, he was a great storyteller. And that made me interested in history, because when I was growing up, everyone else was out in the street playing, you know, baseball or whatever, and I was inside sitting with my grandfather, telling him to tell me stories about Bolachov, because not necessarily that they were so interesting in themselves, but because he told them well. And that made me interested in storytelling. You know, of my grandfather, it was famously said in our family, our extended family, that if you went to the grocery store to buy a quart of milk, you would come back with a quart of milk. If Grandpa went to the grocery store to buy a quart of milk, he would come back with the quart of milk. He would also have won the lottery. He would have met his first two wives by accident. He would have met his third wife. He would have run into a long-lost friend from Bolachov. He would have had an amazing experience. And of course, I was 40 before I realized it was all lies, but that didn't matter because he made everything into a story. And that was very interesting to me. So it made me interested in family history. And as a sort of nerdy, strange child, I immediately started collecting stories. And it I mean, it's very clear to me that the reason I became a writer essentially was my grandfather, because it made me interested in the mechanics of storytelling. You know, I thought my grandfather had a sister named Sylvia, not her real name. And I have a friend who just wrote a memoir, and she refers to a character. She says, "I will call him A, although his real name was B." Sylvia, not her real name, who was, you know, every family, I know this is true of all cultures, every family, like when you're a child, you think of the grandparental generation as like Greek gods, you know, like everyone has one quality, right? So like Sylvia in our family was the goddess of bitterness, you know. She was the bitter, strange people, or you would run into them on the street and they say, Sylvia, the bitter one. You know, you didn't know why she was bitter, what made her bitter. She was bitter. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because there was a sort of a quality about these people that made them sort of mythic to me. And that made me interested in the act of sort of mythologizing, which is the act of storytelling. You know, how do people become who they are? And my grandfather would talk about everything, literally, except his brother Shmuel. The one story you could never get him to tell you was what happened to Uncle Shmuel. We knew he had been killed. Of course we knew he had been killed. But it was strange to me, and it sort of created a strange mystery for me, that on the one hand he could be so garrulous about so many things, and on the other hand he could be so silent. So there were, from the beginning, these sort of two motivations for me. The physical resemblance, which of course is a visual thing, and the verbal, the sort of absence of narratives about Shmuel. And that was basically the engine for what became a lifelong search on my part to find out the answer to the question that was repeatedly asked when I was growing up, which is what happened to Uncle Shmuel. And just to sort of make a very long story short, what happened is that, you know, for years, it's already easy to forget, but, you know, for years, the idea of doing archival research or any kind of research behind the Iron Curtain about Jewish families was just not possible, right? And, you know, it's only in the past 15 years that you can do these kind of things. So for a long time, I just sort of lost the idea. You know, when I was a kid, I was always making family trees and charts and index cards and all of this kind of thing. But there was always this sort of, you know, I should add, this was before computers. You know, now I touch one button on my computer, it spits out a 65-page, beautifully aligned family tree. You know, then I was like with rulers and, you know, quadrants, making lines and everything. So I was doing all of this research, but there was this sort of hole. I always thought of it as a hole in the story, because the one, you know, the only set of dates that we never knew was about these people. Nothing. And my grandfather would never talk about it. And I'm just going to tell you a little story that might be a good lead-in to our discussion, because one of the things my book is obsessed with, I would say, is precisely the way that stories get turned into their final versions, and the way that we as listeners can be trusting for the wrong reasons, and the way that in our desire to have a satisfying story we can misperceive the actual facts of something. And here's an example. Because I've sort of built this, as you just heard, it's very self-consciously built into the fabric of my own story of how I looked for Uncle Shmuel. You're constantly on your guard. How do you know this story is true? Why is there a different version? How can they be made to coincide? What, you know, there's a kind of anxiety about narrative all through the book. When I was growing up, I naturally assumed that the reason that my grandfather did not talk about his brother is that it was just too painful, it was too horrible. Which it was. And then he died, and we made a discovery. And I'm now going to do something that those who have read my book are very familiar with, which is I'm going to stop the story and tell you an early story, which you need to know before this story. My grandfather was known as what they used to call a snappy dresser. He was a very fastidious, meticulous, sort of Beau Brummel, and he loved to dress up. And I, as a child, I should say that my own father was a mathematician, worked for an aerospace company. So my model for male dress was that you would wear the same sweatshirt 3 months in a row. And it never occurred to me that a man would be interested in clothes. And when Grandpa came to visit, as he did every summer, to get away from the heat in Florida, I would spend every morning watching him get dressed because it was amazing to me. You know, he would take 2 hours. You know, he would lay out different outfits and he would look at them and then he would switch them and maybe that tie went better with the different socks or, you know, whatever. And one of the things that I used to be fascinated by was that he had 2 wallets. He always carried 2 wallets. He had a wallet that he kept in his trouser pocket, and he had a long breast pocket wallet. And so mesmerized was I by the fact that he had 2 wallets that it never occurred to me to ask why. Okay, that's what you need to know. Now, in 1980, my grandfather died. And my mother and I flew down to Florida to deal with his effects. My mother was an only child. It was a very straightforward transaction. And we found this famous extra wallet. And it turned out that in the second wallet, he was carrying a series of letters that his brother Shmuel had been writing him in the year 1939, begging for help to get out of Poland to his American relatives. And then I understood, belatedly, that the real reason, or certainly a reason that I believe in very strongly, that he couldn't talk about his brother, was that he felt this overpowering guilt his entire life, that he had not been able to help his brother. Or else, why would he carry them around like a hair shirt with him his entire life? And that's an example of a sort of obsession of mine that runs through the book about the misperceptions of the present about the past, because we are hopelessly locked in our own moments, and that no history is narrated in an abstract way. Every story that's told is told by a person, whether it's me or my grandfather, with an agenda and a control over the facts, or not even the facts, the inventions, whatever they are. And that's a sort of an issue from my intimate family past that colored my appreciation of everything that I encountered during the long search over 5 years when I went literally around the world tracking down the last few surviving people who knew Shmuel. And I would say that the primary concern of this book is not, as it were, the Holocaust in a sort of naive way, what happened, but how does, this is a phrase I keep using in the book, how does what happened become the story of what happened? And I think it's an important distinction, as anyone knows. You know, and the last thing I'll say before I eagerly run to my conversation is, you know, people have a notion, you know, the book is described, you know, it's this exhaustive account of what happened in this one Polish town. But I have news for you, and maybe I shouldn't say this in front of my publisher. If I wrote the exhaustive account, if I transcribed every tape, if I put everything I learned, it would be a 5,000-page book that no one would read, right? So that's something to think about. So those are sort of some of how this happened, and now I'll just have my conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. This is the mother of the writer. After a lifetime of collecting, 5 years of research, uncountable air miles, and the mother says over the phone, "My family ruined their lives by always looking at the past, and I don't want you to be like that." That's quite a reproach after 500 pages of book. Wasn't she a bit right?
Well, yeah, what could I say? Mothers are always right. I know she's listening somewhere. I mean, it was an interesting moment because my mother said to me right before my last trip, and I had already been traveling for 4 years at this point, and it was a shock because my mother's family, being a family of storytellers, you know, never gets tired of talking about themselves. And so for her to suddenly say, I had just announced to her that I was going back another final time to Ukraine. And she said to me on the phone, and it shocked me. She said, okay, but this is the last trip. What she said was, genug is genug. And she said, my family ruined their lives by always thinking about the past, and I don't want you to be like them. Yeah, she had said that in 2001. I'd have a lot fewer frequent flyer miles. But I think it raises an interesting issue, which is very interesting to me, both as a member of my family and as a writer, which is that because to our recent past, we have an emotional connection, and particularly a trauma, right, like the Holocaust. And so we want nothing to be left behind. You know, we want everything to be known all the time. But you know, I think about this all the time. If you were to keep importing all of the past into the present, there would not be room to live in the present. And that's why we have stories, because what the story gives you is the narrative, the meaning of what happened, so to speak. But it doesn't take up all the room that the actual totality of events had. You know, people always ask me, what do I think, you know, the story of the Holocaust is going to be in the future? Well, I don't know, you know, but because I'm a classical Greek scholar, you know, when people talk to me about the future, I'm not talking about November. I'm talking about the year 4007, right? Well, it's an interesting way to think, right? And I think, well, probably in the year 4007, the Holocaust is going to be narrated the way that the Exodus from Egypt is narrated, at a ritual meal, once a year maybe, where the important contours of this story are repeated from generation to generation in order to make them comprehensible. Because what we want is the comprehensibility. What did it mean, the event? And that you can't do, because the people of 4007 will have their own further stories. So one is in a kind of a poignant position, because right now that feels unthinkable, right? No one's going to read my book in the year 4007. They're not going to want to know the details of those 6 lives. They're going to want to know what was the story, and that's what they're going to get. And I'm just very interested in this, because in order to become the story, it has to lose precisely what we're attached to right now, which is every little detail. And it's an interesting process.
But already something happened in that process, and that happened during our lifetime. We could say by coincidence, and that is that during the first part of your life, Beljergov is an imaginary city. You know relatively more people coming from there and having vivid memories of that place, but the city itself is not even on our planet. It is a city in history, and simply de facto, behind the Iron Curtain, when in the end you go there for the first time, you can rent a car in Poland. You quite easily can cross the border to Ukraine. We were speaking before we came here, how that was before 1990, how utterly difficult it was to get there physically, with visa, with traveling, etc. So during the first part of collecting memories, hearing the people coming from there, and as a child, imagining what it could have been like, it really is a city of the imagination. And then comes the relatively dramatic moment that the place is accessible. There is the preparation of the trip, the family goes there, the brothers and sisters go there, and they actually can reach out to a city that so far had existed only in their stories. Was that not a very risky thing to do, to travel into the land of the fantasy?
Well, it's an interesting question, because what I had to do in order to write this book was to essentially give up, as this is the direction of your question. I had to give up the narratives that I had inherited, which were narratives of a fantasy city, and I would say, I want to be clear, a fantasy city for two reasons. In the more obvious way, the fantasy of the immigrant about the old place, right? Every immigrant, I'm sure, who came to America had a model of what it was they left behind. Sometimes it was nostalgic, sometimes it was unhappy, but that became the counter to the life in the present, right? For my grandfather, we have to remember, my grandfather came in the 1920s, and his memories of this place were as a bustling, happy, Habsburg, Austro-Hungarian, multicultural, I think it's safe to say, town, This was not the Russian Pale of Settlement. There were not pogroms, there were not oppressions. I mean, in general, it was a pretty happy place. So I grew up hearing these darling stories, right? So in that sense, it was a fantasy for him. It was the nice things he remembered, But of course, it was also a fantasy in that the reality of that Habsburg happy town was already long superseded by many regimes, So even if I went back, I wasn't going to find a normal continuation of the life of the town that I had heard about. And I have to tell you, when you are an American, growing up from immigrant grandparents, all my grandparents were immigrants except one, there's this thing called the old country, right? Everyone talks about the old country. I thought there was actually a place called the old country, like you could go there with a passport, and there would be someone and it would say, welcome to the old country. And you're, of course you're aware that it's a Geschichte, it's a story, it's a fantasy. And when you go back, in order to get the real story, my story, rather than his stories, I had to give that up, because I knew when I went to Bologov, what I was going to find was going to make all those stories crumble to dust. And in fact, I remember we were taking off in the plane, the LOT Polish Airlines plane. I will never forget that. And, even if you're like in pierogi class, it's not so great on LOT Polish. And we were taxiing down the runway, gathering speed to take off, and my sister Jennifer burst into this sort of hysterical, cackling, demented laughter. And I said, what's so funny? And she said, we're flying to Bologov. It just sounded so insane that it was like a place you could go to in an airplane. And of course, when we got there, the concreteness of it was all too palpable, because this was a place that is the dead. It's like a burnt, dead place now. The life of the place was eviscerated first in the war, when all the Jews were taken away, and then they had 60 years of Stalinist economy, so it's a dead place. I mean, the center of the town, the Rinnik, the square where were all the shops and the commerces, they're still not occupied. No one has gone back and built businesses in these places since 1941, So to go there was very devastating, but that was the beginning of my own story.
Yes, but the own story begins by ruining the old story. The own story begins by finding the completely dead reality vis-à-vis the very vivid memories of the generation of your grandparents, and going to fit the pieces, but there were hardly any pieces left, into a picture. So the first thing is a disillusion. The story is much better than the reality, isn't it? It always is, of course. But coming there the first time, how soon could you go back? I mean, it's a horrifying place, given the memories, but also given the existence of a town without any life, without any markets, without any shops, without any relevant cultural aspects. I would have fled it immediately.
Well, it was interesting, because what happened was, in a sense, that in this dead place, we sort of actually found nothing. It's interesting, because if I had only made that trip, which was the only trip I knew to make, when I started on this trip, I didn't know what I was looking for. People say, oh, it's an odyssey. And I always say, yeah, but Odysseus knew where he was going. I didn't know he was going home. I didn't know where I was going. I was just, following this bouncing ball, so to speak. And in fact, it's interesting because it brings in another thing, which I know that you've noticed, which is a sort of the role of fortuitousness and pure accident in all of this. Here you think you are the narrator, controlling all your bits. And everything important that happened to me in this search was a total accident. So here's what I mean. We went to Balakhov. And we went, and my guide, my trusty Ukrainian guide, Alex, said, well, if you want to find out about what happened during the war here, he said, first of all, as you know, Stalin loved to move populations around like chess pieces. And so actually most of the original, even the Ukrainian population, was decimated. And now it's all Russians from central Russia living there. They don't know anything about the war. He said, but the best thing to do is to go on a Sunday, stand outside of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and grab old ladies as they come out of the church, basically. And no, literally, because it was a town that was small enough that you could do that, right? And so we stood there. I mean, I felt totally ridiculous, and so we were like grabbing old Ukrainian ladies, babushkas with scarves, and saying, do you remember Shmuel Yeager? It was very poignant, actually. And, it was a small town. So someone would say, yeah, I sort of remember the name, but, I didn't schlep on Lot Polish Airlines to hear that sentence. And finally, we talked to one old lady who remembered them really carefully. She remembered them. And that was incredibly emotional for us, because the last person I knew in my life who knew Shmuel was my grandfather, who had died 25 years before. The idea that I could, in the year 2001, be talking to some old babushka, and she said, yes, I remember him, the girls, the shop, the this. It was incredibly emotional. But I have to say, it wasn't a story. So we schlepped to Ukraine, we met one old lady who remembered them, and now I'm supposed to write something, And what happened, and this is important, was the following. I had originally, this was never going to be a book. I was going to write an article for the New York Times. That's how this all started. I originally thought, I'll write an article about going back and finding the mystery of Uncle Shmuel, whatever. I didn't even know what I was talking about. And so we had this thing, which was emotional for us, because we were connected, right? But then I had to go home in August of 2001 and write a story that would be interesting to the readers of the New York Times. And I didn't have that story. I had nothing. The nothingness represented by the crumbling of my fantasies of Balakhov was really nothing. I thought, how am I turning this into a story? How do I make it emotional for someone who's not related to Shmuel? To us it was amazing, but it's not really a great story. So what I did what all writers do, which is I avoided my editor for 6 months. And, I pretended, I said, is your mail server down? I'm not getting any of these emails, And in February, 6 months later, I was in my apartment in New York City and the phone rang. And I pick up the phone and there's a lot of transatlantic crackle, as it turned out, trans-Pacific crackle. Noise, hissing, and a voice which, because I've been well-trained, I immediately recognized as a Polish Jew, says, Mr. Mendelsohn? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you don't know me. He said, but I'm calling from Sydney, Australia. So, I'm a journalist, so I got my pen and I got a little sticky note and I wrote Sydney, Australia. He said, my name is Jack Green. So I wrote Jack Green, and he said, I still laugh. He said, I heard through the grapevine you're looking for people who knew Shmuel Yeager. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. I said, what grapevine is that? I just couldn't believe it. And he said, and then he said the sentence that changed my life. He said, well, don't waste your time in Ukraine. He said, I'm a Jew of Balakhov, and I was the high school girlfriend of Ruchala Yeager, Shmuel's third daughter. And he said, you don't know, but there's still some Balakhov Jew survivors left, and you should come to Australia and talk to us. And that was the beginning of the book. But I had nothing to do with it. It came out of the sky. It was a beshert, as we say in Dutch. It was a total mystery,
But
so the story, the point I'm trying to make is this story happened to me. As much as I talk about narrative and control, it just happened to me.
I just go back to the trip, the first trip. Normally, when you set out for a trip, you buy a travel guide, the latest edition, with the freshest figures and the best maps. If you go to that part of the world for this trip, you're going to look for Baedeker's Guide to Western Ukraine, 1912 or 1913. Which one did you use?
Well, I had the 1913 Baedeker actually with me. I'm famously incurious and lazy, and I actually never buy the most recent guide because I always want things to happen to me. And if I plan too much, they're never going to happen. I'm the despair of my friends, because when we travel together, you know, they have lists of museums and sites, and I just sort of walk around the streets and hope that something good will happen.
Yeah, and then you go.
But I was wedded to this idea, you know, it was so poignant and ridiculous and meshuggah that I thought I'm going to find the Balakhov of 1913, you know, by schlepping this Baedeker of 1913.
Yeah, and you travel with maps of almost an age ago, information about that era that doesn't exist, that world has disappeared. Right. And then you end up first, you hinted at it, explaining to the locals what their history is. They are displaced persons often. We both have the experience of going to Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, explaining to people that it has a certain role in Jewish history.
Right.
People being very, very amazed. When you came there in the first place, you were confronted with these people, not having any memory at all, it must have felt like the wrong planet, like the wrong plan, like the wrong idea.
Well, it was interesting because, you know, because there are so few people living in this town who had any history of the town, you know, anything, even Ukrainians who were there during the war. There's only very few old Ukrainians living who were there before the war. So, you know, and then it's just these nice Russian people who have no connection at all to the history. So it was strange. But I'll tell you a sort of a story of this problem, because I know we cheated, we were talking before the conversation, and you were telling me that you've had the same thing, where you have to tell the people who are living in your town what their own history is. And we went on the first trip. We went to the Jewish cemetery in Balakhov, which miraculously was not desecrated, even by the Germans. For some reason, they left it alone. It's a cemetery that goes back to the 16th century. It's a very old cemetery. So I thought, you know, maybe I'll, by accident, of course, find something. And here was the most, in a weird way, I think the most emotionally upsetting thing that happened to me in all of my travels was this. We were in the cemetery, and we went to the cemetery, and, you know, now it's like a goat grazing there, but nobody's bothering it. It's just an abandoned place. And there were some Ukrainian children playing, not in a bad way. You know, they're just playing, jumping up and down, swinging from a tree, whatever. And so we're taking pictures, whatever, and my brother Matt was taking pictures of the kids. And I said to Alex, the interpreter, I said, ask them if they know what this place is. And I can't even tell this story, it's terrible. And they said, yes, this is the Jewish cemetery. And I said, okay. And I suddenly had this idea, and I said to Alex, I said, ask them if they know what a Jew is. And they didn't know what a Jew was. And I thought, if my grandfather could live to see the day when a Ukrainian in Balakhov didn't know what a Jew, I mean, that felt to me like a total, that made me aware of what the word extermination means. You know, I still can't get over that. It was just very overwhelming. And that's what you're dealing with, you know.
And then you find it in odd cities like Sydney. I mean, where would you have looked for Balyechev on the Australian coast? Then you find it in the memories of people quite close to you, actually. I mean, Mrs. Bagley is quite close to where you are in New York. So you're actually hinting, I was, in the first place, looking at the wrong place.
Right.
And I find it on...
Everywhere else.
Everywhere else, yeah. And what is it that you then can reconstruct? Because there is scarce hard evidence. There is one document in Yad Vashem about what happened in 1941 in Balyechev, what happened in the Catholic house there, right. Which is horrible. But the real hard facts of history, of the historian, the professional historians, are limited. What you get is stories that you trust as a story, but you slightly mistrust as history. So what do you end up with?
Well, I mean, basically, I mean, as you rightly, intuit, what I've done is so there's a process. First, all my grandfather's stories had to be abandoned because that Balachav was long gone. And the book is really the story of reconstructing a new set of stories. But you're always being told in the book that it's, and I tell you, I think I even said this in the end of part one. I said I didn't want to read books. I didn't want to study. I wanted to go talk to old Jewish people the way I did when I was 7 years old and get the story that way. And the whole book, of course, has, I hope, because I wanted it to have this, a quality of orality. You're sitting down and being told a story. And that's really what it is. Those people told me stories. Now I'm telling you the stories, and I'm making my own story about how I found the old people. But it's just a bunch of stories. And there's always a difference between those stories and what happened. Because, of course, what I keep learning, and this story I was telling you before about the wallet and how I misperceived my grandfather's motivations, is the preparation in the book for what subsequently keeps happening. Is all these people I talked to were telling me very carefully crafted narratives, not necessarily in an insidious way, but they're telling their Geschichte. Everyone has been working on it for a long time, right? And as I turned out, some of them were insidious. I would go someplace and talk to an old lady, and then 6 months later, I went and I heard the rest of the story that she wasn't telling me, which maybe presented someone in her family in a bad light. You see, so you're always being made aware that everything you're getting is a story. And then it was important for me, you refer to these documents that I quote, that in fact, something that I never do in the book is try to imagine in a novelistic way, I would say, what happened in Balachav. The only time you ever learn what happened in Balachav in a, say, let's call it a documentary way, in a historian's way, I just quote an entire witness statement because I don't feel...
You're very prudent about that.
I can tell that story. That's a story I don't feel comfortable imagining, supposing what was going on in their minds, what it must have been like, because there's nothing in my experience that allows me as a storyteller to imagine that. And I felt, particularly in an age of cheap theme parks, and you were there, and, Disney World, and, all of that, that we have to be very careful about what is real and what is an imaginative act of reconstruction.
I think that is a very important ethical moment in the book, because after receiving the document, you write deliberately and elaborately on the idea of, should I imagine what happened? Should I read this as a suggestion for my imagination? And in every single sentence, you correct yourself and you say, no, I don't want to, I cannot, I may not, I don't want to, I cannot, I may not. That's a very essential moment, because it, as it were, draws the boundaries of what imagination may do from an ethical motive.
Right.
Now, that is in a book in which the imagination is so crucial. You begin as an upgrowing child with a city in the imagination, inherited from the memories of people who came from there. There goes the grown-up man as a journalist and a scholar to check up with the facts. He finds an empty world, not corresponding to what he was looking for, and he ends up writing a new city of the imagination. Imagination is crucial, the imagination of history, until we arrived on the edge of what the Germans call wie es wirklich gewesen, what it really was. Why so?
Well, I mean, this is just an idiosyncratic thing. I'm not, sort of making a rule for all writers. I just feel that I am not a novelist. A great novelist can write about anything, and it is a legitimate. That's why it's literature. I believe that very strongly. But I'm a journalist. I'm a nonfiction writer, and I just felt that, and this is also part of the sort of a private polemic of mine about the sort of cheap synthetic quality of a lot of reconstructions. I mean, it's particularly in American culture right now. We want to believe that every experience is available to us. You watch these programs and people confessing their worst, crimes all the time, and we love that. We're really into that. And I just thought in that cultural environment, it's important to mark off a space where you can't have anyone's experience, you know, and I just felt really strongly, I can make a good story. Believe me, I know this, I'm not modest. I can make a good story about a lot of things, but only if I know. I can make you laugh with my stories of old Jewish people in Miami Beach, because I know that stuff. I was there. I know the texture of that life. But I don't know what it's like to be a 16-year-old girl in a building where her whole 1,000 people from her town are being tortured and shot for 36 hours. And I'm not going to describe it. I'm not going to describe it. I'm going to quote the document in which someone who was there describes it. I feel that's a line I can't cross, but that's something for me. I'm not making an edict about writing, but it's an edict I had to make for myself. And in fact, if you read my book carefully, there's one scene, a long scene, that looks like a reconstruction, and it's the only one that turns out to be wrong, in which I imagine something, and you find out later that I'm seriously wrong.
Yeah,
and I did that on purpose, because it shows you, it reminds you of the limit. You know.
I skipped that question for that scene. And I cannot read that a fragment but as a comment on very vulgar sorts of fiction. Coming back to what I said when I tried to introduce the book, there is in every single chapter a biblical text analyzed, commented very carefully with two classical commentators, one from the Middle Ages, Rami, the French scholar, and one from the present, Friedman. These are the whetstones for the philologist, but the text is used to go in depth of the biblical history, the mythological history, and to try to find a meaning. I can best explain it with a good example of the last chapter, where it is the biblical story of Lot's wife, who, when the Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by God, looks back and is punished by becoming a salt pillar. Here is, of course, a comment on the risk of looking back. In each and every single chapter you do that. You use these biblical passages. What was the essential driving power to do that, to make that layer into the book?
Well, you know, this is the kind of thing you hate to admit, but it actually wasn't part of my plan for the book at all when I started writing. It's a sort of a notion that came to me when I was already deep into the writing of the book. And what happened, the reason that there's this sort of scaffolding, is how I think of it, of ruminations, I would say, about biblical texts scattered through my narrative, is actually, I have to tell you a story. I was writing the second part of my book in which I'm describing the discovery of these letters. And a question that naturally arose when I read these letters is, what did they write back? You know, we had letter after letter saying, send me this much money, send me $5,000, we need this kind of paper, we need this kind of affidavit, these kinds of paper. And I said, what did they do? And I had to entertain a possibility that maybe they failed them. You see, because I don't, in a lot of ways, I still don't. I didn't know anything about Shmuel. Maybe he was the kvetch in the family. Maybe he was always asking for money. Maybe they didn't like him. Maybe he was always, that's why they came and he stayed. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm just saying I had to, as a writer, also as a family member, imagine maybe, you know, maybe they didn't take it seriously. They didn't really have a sense of what was going on, you know, I didn't know. But I had to imagine that my grandfather failed his brother, and it made me very uncomfortable. And as a kind of nerdy, scholarly reflex, I did something that was very natural for me, is I thought, maybe I'll go find a text that will tell me about brothers, how conflicts between brothers start. And so, of course, I thought of Cain and Abel. And I thought, you know, it's perfect. It's Jewish, you know. And well, because I sort of did the same thing in my first book, except in my first book I used Greek myths as this sort of ancient intertext. So it's actually not a revolution in my writing. And I read the Cain and Abel, and I just became really interested in it. It's an amazing story. Not least because it never tells you what went on between the brothers. It only told you what happened, but it never tells you, explains in the way we're desperate to have it explained, what one said to the other.
We don't have the letters.
We don't.
No.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I just got interested and I started reading it. And then, as you say, I started reading Rashi and I started reading a new commentary on the Bible. And suddenly I had, one of those light bulb moments. And I thought, ding, I'm going to put this whole thing in my book. Because I thought it was important that the reader of this book, people say, or in reviews, they say, oh, it's, like a breathless detective story, which is great. And, one lives to read that. But it's not just a detective story. It's a story of terrible things that were done by actual people to other actual people, and you should never forget that. And for that reason, I thought there should be these moments in my text where you have to stop the detective story and think, what is this about? What is this about? What are the moral issues? What are the ethical issues? And the Bible does that for you. I mean, the biblical bit. For example, just to go very quickly, I then went to Australia, and I met all these Balachavers in Australia. And that was the first time I ever heard the real story from A to Z of what happened in Balachav from the day the Germans got there, July 1st, 1941, to the day the Soviets liberated the town. And then it happens that the next the chapter after Cain and Abel is Noah and the flood. And I reread Noah and the flood, and I thought, what is this a story about? This is a story about extermination. Noah and the flood is the story about the extermination of every person in the world, with a few survivors who then have to make their life over again. And that was the story I was sitting at a kitchen table in Sydney, Australia, listening to. And at that moment, I thought, this is going to work. But you need to be reminded that that's what the story is. It's not an adventure. It's not a detective. It's not an odyssey. Or maybe it is. But there's a moral dimension. And I thought that was important.
May I suggest that you're slightly less naive and slightly less innocent than you now feign, because it fits remarkably well. Every biblical passage you use...
As I say, I'm just lucky. I mean, I really
am. Slightly cleverer than lucky alone. Because it transcends the story. By confronting it and measuring it with the classical biblical text, it responds. It is what you said in the beginning. I'm a classical scholar, I'm interested in 4007 and not only in 2007.
But as you know, and this may be the good final thing to say before we open the floor to questions, when you are a good storyteller, you don't come back just with the carton of milk, right? The biblical stuff fits because I was looking,
You went out for a bottle of milk and you came back with the Torah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But what does it do by hindsight to the story? I mean, it mythologizes it. It gives it a deeper meaning.
But the Torah does that. It takes the story of a family, and it is a universal document about many things: morality, ethics, law, politics, nationalism, internationalism, blah, blah, blah. But it does that very self-consciously by focusing increasingly on one family and saying, let's see what happens to them.
Yeah.
So I had a good model,
Yeah, and you follow, there is a certain point in which you say, here are my genes. I follow them back through the family tree like it is printed in the book. I follow them back to Odessa, where the Russian guy comes to the city. I follow them back, and you end up in Ur der Chaldean, the city that Abraham left. That is connecting with the oldest part of Jewish history. May I suggest that it is part of trying to explain to yourself what in a non-religious sense may mean that Jewish identity?
Yes, I'm certainly willing to, entertain that. I mean, it's among other things, this book is a book about a secular person struggling with a great religious text and trying to see if it can still mean something, even if you don't have the content of actual faith. So yes. And as I say, if you're looking, we're going to find it. If you want the story to mean something, you're going to find me, if it's a good story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We open up the floor for you now. Whom may I invite to take the microphone?
If we weren't in Amsterdam, my mother would be here, and she would always be the first person to stand up and ask a question. I'd be like, Ma, genug is genug,
That would be a comment, but it is not yet enough, so who? Would you use the microphone? Thank you.
I am very interested to know why you choose Rashi as explaining the Torah, and why no other.
Well, why I chose Rashi as my older commentator. I mean, honestly, because it's the only one I was really familiar with. I'm not a scholar of the Torah. I'm a scholar of Greek tragedy, and I just knew about Rashi, and just so I thought, at this early stage, before I knew it was going to be in the book, I just said, oh well, there's that Rashi guy everybody keeps talking about, and I mean, no, really. I mean, I didn't know a lot, and I thought, but I knew people thought he was smart, and so I bought the Rashi commentary, and it was very interesting to me. You see, as a classic scholar, I know about commentaries and commentaries on commentaries, and it's interesting to me. So once that took over, I was hooked, And then I just thought, and I meant to mention this before, once I had Rashi, I thought, well, I just don't want Rashi. Let's see what a totally modern and it just so happens, again, it wasn't something I orchestrated, that there had just been published in the United States a rabbi's new sort of popular commentary on the Torah, with the Hebrew text and his interpretation. And then it occurred to me that it was going to be interesting because basically, in my story, the story of the search, the interviewing, the witnesses, one is constantly confronted by this problem of variant versions, and that sort of goes through the book. Who's really telling the truth? But what happens in the biblical part is that even the sort of authoritativeness of what is the most authoritative document, the Bible, is thrust into this same murky ground because I'm also giving you the arguments between these two commentators about what it means. And they quite often have wildly different ideas. So the idea that everything is up for debate, everything is a version, an interpretation. How do you know who's the best philologist, whether of Rashi of the Torah or of what Jack Green told me in Australia? How do you know? How do you dig out the real truth? And so I just thought it was interesting to have an argument between commentators to accompany all the other arguments that were going on in my book about what's the truth.
You don't know.
I don't know.
Everybody has his own choice.
Yes, right? But of course, the thing that I think is interesting about all this stuff about authority and versions and commentaries and interpretation, this is a book very much about interpretation, right? Is that my book puts it on the surface, right? Be nervous. It's telling you, I'm just a good storyteller like my grandfather, and maybe he didn't meet his first wife when he went to get the milk. But every history book you pick up is also that. Not in the sense of falsifying, of course, but everything is a decision. What you keep in, what you leave out, what's the theme you're emphasizing, what's the thing not interesting to you. Every book about history is subject to the same issues. It's just in a different way, which I think is worth keeping in mind.
Oui.
It's never made clear in the book why your grandfather was not able to help his brother. It's an open question.
Mm-hmm.
Have you discovered any information about what was possible and what was not possible at that time in history, which has made it since a little bit more clear? Have you, for example, discovered that he couldn't have helped him, even if he had wanted to, because, for example, there was no postal service, so he wasn't able to write back at that? Have you gone into that any more deeply to find out what the actual possibilities were at that moment that he could have made use of?
Well, actually, I did, as much as I know about that actually is already in the book. It's open-ended because I don't know, and I'm not willing to say what I don't know. I give you the option of thinking that maybe my grandfather didn't behave well or what, I don't know. You know, but what I do know, and this is in the book, is what I found out from Jack Green. He said in 1939 in Balakh, there was a list of people trying to get papers to go, and it was 5 years long. You were told you'd get your papers in 1944, and as he memorably told me, in 1944, everyone in Balakh was dead. So that's what we know. And the U.S. was closed in 1939. You know, the whole thing was another fantasy. That we know. I also know that the amount, it's very interesting to sort of talk about this in the Netherlands right now, because the almost identical letters of Otto Frank were just discovered in the YIVO archive in New York. It was this headline event all over the States, and I'm sure here. And he writes the same things to all his American friends. I need $5,000. $5,000 was the magic number. And $5,000 in 1939 for a lower middle class family in the United States was probably more than my grandfather made in a year, you know? So the idea that Otto Frank, luckily, had rich American friends. Schmiel did not, right? So it was just so poignant for me to read these letters, and, you know, he says the same thing. You know, it's the same, it's a kind of almost a form letter that people were sending. But we don't know. You know, well, my mother and her cousins got together one weekend, the children of Schmiel's siblings, and I taped them all, and they were trying to remember. And they said, yes, every night they were having desperate meetings in their apartment building in the Bronx, you know, what can we do, whatever. But if they had been able to do something, it you know, would have been vervallen, as we say. It was just a waste. There was no way it was going to happen.
And in the earlier letters, he thanks them for sending a certain amount of money.
Yes, at some point he says, thank you for the $80 or whatever. So, you know, I would like to believe that they helped him. I tried very hard not to let my own adoration for my grandfather get in the way of me as a journalist trying to assess the story. But I think they did send whatever scraps of money that they had. But you couldn't get papers anyway. It was a dream. It was a dream.
I think we should, for those people who not yet read the book, should explain that he had been in America, that he had been there for a year.
Right.
He was the one who left Egypt to go to the Promised Land and return to Egypt again.
Right. Schmiel came to America in 1913. You see, the father, my great-grandfather, died suddenly as a young guy in his 40s in 1912. And he had been a prosperous businessman, so the family was well-heeled. And then everything fell apart. So Schmiel is the oldest child, then 18 years old, in 1913 came to America to see if they should settle there. They already had an aunt and an uncle there, and he lived with this aunt and uncle. The aunt, still 100 years later, known in my family as Tante, my great-great-great-aunt, and he didn't like it. So he went back. Now, this is interesting because it brings up an issue that's very important to me. You know, on my book tour in the States, I had several times this happen to me. A person would stand up in the audience and would yell at me. A woman yelled at me, I'll never forget this, in Detroit. Who was I just talking to about Detroit? At this big thing in Detroit. And she said, how stupid was your uncle? She said, couldn't he see the handwriting on the wall? How could he go back to Europe? And I laughed. I said, in 1913, he should predict that Hitler will rise to power in 20 years in Germany and destroy the Jews of Europe? I said, but it's aside from that, which is ridiculous, there's something very important going on, which is the thing I kept trying to avoid while I was writing about them was precisely not to, as we say, backshadow, right? To cast our hindsight onto these people as they lived their lives. You know, not just this, which is a ridiculous example, but even until the last moment. People never believe that the worst thing is going to happen to them until it happens to them. You know, you're always rationalizing. Look, here's a good example. I live in New York City. Everyone I know, every single person I know in New York City is convinced that there is going to be another major terrorist attack on New York City. I haven't sold my apartment. They haven't sold their apartments because it is not in the nature of most people to do what this woman wanted Uncle Shmuel to do. You know, you think somehow you're going to get by. I'm sure, and I know this for a fact from listening, from sitting and listening for 5 years to the last Jews of Bologov. You know, a guy said to me, he said, while it was happening to us, we didn't believe it was happening to us. He said, while it was happening to us, we kept saying, he said to me, he said, we kept saying we thought we could handle with them, you know, we could deal with them, right? Because that's the impulse of people, you know, not to jump off the roof, but to somehow you're going to save your wife, save your children, bribe somebody, find a hiding place, run for the wood, you know, something. And I just thought this example, which I've just told you, was very important to me because we, in our comfortable position of hindsight, you know, we say, oh, they should have done that, they should have done that. Well, you know, I think it's very dangerous to a person who's interested in trying to dig down to the concrete nuggets that we can imagine about, or retrieve rather, about these people, not to project onto them things that they could not have been thinking. You know, and you know, another thing that comes to mind is every time I interviewed someone, I would finish interviewing them, and then I would call my mother on my cell phone, and I would let them talk to her. It was a very emotional thing, you know, because these people never dreamed that their friends, the Jaegers and Bologov, had American relatives who 60 years later would descend on them. I mean, it was incredible for them. So that was always an emotional conversation. And my mother said, at one point, talking to someone in Australia, Jack Green, she suddenly burst into tears and she said, why couldn't just one of my relatives have survived, you know? And he laughed and he said, you know, it was just dumb luck. He said, it wasn't that the ones who lived, you know, Jack Green was in a hiding place just like, as we found out, the one Shmuel was in. Wasn't that Jack Green was smarter than Shmuel, better than Shmuel, more deserving than Shmuel. Shmuel was unlucky. A neighbor saw somebody bringing food to the house and thought, why are they bringing food to the house? You know, but it's dumb luck. So you can't project motivations, reasons, structures, meanings when there were none. It was just what happened. That was what happened. It just happened like that. Yeah.
Gary Schwartz.
One of the themes in your book has remained undiscussed, and that is the least mediated part of it. As it isn't just about interpretations and uncertainties of history, about the Holocaust. You also write about the nature of evil and about violence and the birth of murder. And you relate this to the Holocaust, but also to the story of Cain and Abel, but to your relationship to your own brother. There's the sibling rivalry that is the least mediated part of the book, and I wanted to know how you really relate your own incident with your brother to all of these vast events in history and to the nature of evil.
Well, you know, I would say that this incident with my brother, in the book I talk about, I'm talking about Cain and Abel and my grandfather and his brother and me and my brother, the one, as it turns out, that I made all my trips with because he's the photographer for the book, whom I never got along with until this book, actually. And how I broke his arm in a fit of rage when I was like 11 and he was 9. I can't remember how old I was. And I mean, I think in that sense, I'm not making any hard and fast statements about the nature of evil. What interests me about that incident is that, you know, it's important in the story as I tell it that I can't remember why I was so angry at him. I was just angry at him, and I just wanted to hurt him, you know. And that to me was significant because, as I said before, in the Bible, you never, if you read it as a philologist, if you read it carefully, the Hebrew text of the Bible never tells you why Cain was so irritated at Abel. It's sort of hinted, but you never get the magic sentence. And in fact, it says, he said to him, and there's a blank after that. You never know what this magic thing is. It was very interesting. So to me, it's more, I would say, and I'm not just saying this because I'm trying to, get out of a hard question, but I just think, to me, the thing that the nature of evil, like the nature of good, is inexplicable. It's inexplicable. Why? I mean, we could be Freudian, we could have 1,000 reasons, but when push comes to shove, to me the important thing was, and particularly, as you know, in the story of the Holocaust, why some people acted well and some people acted badly is anybody's guess. And that is as far as I get. I don't think I have any brilliant ideas about the nature of it. We want evil to look like something, right? There's a certain other book that's been published recently in which it shows you this is what evil looks like. It's a guy who's a pedophile, incestuous, homicidal, blah, blah. You know what? That's a fantasy, right? I mean, of course it's true. But the fact is, when you do the kind of trip I did, what the French called la Shoah par balle, the Eastern Poland shooting people in mass graves before the machines got going, you're always confronted with the same story. Neighbors, 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 for centuries, for generations, next-door neighbors, and then one day, some of the neighbors are pitchforking the other neighbors. And what that switch is, I would never claim to know, but I heard the stories in which the switch got switched, if you see what I mean. And that, to me, is important precisely because you can't know. This to me, because my book is a story about a lot of evil, clearly evil acts. You read witness statements, you read these descriptions, you can't believe the inventiveness of sadism in the killing of these people. The jaw drops. Even you think you've heard everything, and you know what? You've never heard everything. I thought I heard everything. And there are still stories. There are stories I didn't put in the book because my editor just said, you can't, people will stop reading, have some of them. You can't tell all of them. But what's just as interesting is, the important point is, these things were done by ostensibly ordinary people. It wasn't like Dracula, they were just the next door neighbor. They went to church, they had small children, they were nice, and then the next day they were doing unspeakable things. I can't explain it, but I know it happened. But the other thing, which is the corollary to that, is that people did amazingly good things equally inexplicably, right? Every Jew of Bologov was saved by a Ukrainian, right? They don't even know why they saved them. Sometimes they took money, but sometimes they didn't take money. Sometimes it was because they were just ornery. That's interesting. To me, it's like, this movie Schindler's List, which actually I don't like so much. Because, I'll tell you why I don't like it, because the director doesn't understand his own story. The amazing thing about the Schindler story is this guy was a total shit. Excuse my language, the John Adams Institute. Okay? His whole life. And then, who knows why he then saved 1,100 Jews? Because you know what? He was still a shit after the war. He was terrible. He was a terrible guy. Right? That there's that scene where they take their fillings out and they make a ring for him. He sold the ring. He pawned the ring. Okay? But it's an important story because Spielberg doesn't get it. He thinks this guy had a moment at the end where he said, oh, I should have saved more people. I could have done. That's ridiculous. What's important, why it's an important Holocaust story is because you don't know why. Good people did terrible things and terrible people did good thing. I talked to people, Polish people, who said to me, they would say to me, they said, well, I never liked Jews. I was raised not to like, the priest said, the story. I mean, the whole terrible Polish education before the war. And they saved Jews, right? A woman said to me, well, she said, I was thinking, in the Bible, it says you should be nice to your neighbor, whatever it is, and she did that. That's the religious thing she chose to observe, although she did not like Jews. That's an important thing to remember because it's too easy to make it into a pat story that the bad guys look like this and the good guys look like this. And you know what? It was never like that.
I give one or two more questions the opportunity to be asked. If only you remember the advice of your editor not to answer in 5,000 pages, but in 500. The gentleman there.
It was extremely interesting lecture. I do apologize that I didn't read your book yet, but after this evening I will certainly do it. I understand from your story that your uncle Shmuel left for America to see how things are there, and he came back to Borchov, and that he told that he didn't like it there. So my question to you is, he didn't like it, but all his brothers and sisters nevertheless went to anyhow to the States. What did them switch? Why did they were not influenced by the story of Shmuel? And doesn't Shmuel look like the two, to come back to your stories of the Torah, of the Bible, doesn't Shmuel then look like one of the two spies out of the 12 who had to go to look into the promised country to see how it looks like, and that they came back with bad stories? So that's one question I want to know, why your family anyhow went with this bad story to the States. The second question, just out of curiosity, this guy Jaeger out of Sydney, how did he come across to you? How did he find you?
How did the grapevine work? Yeah.
Excuse me?
How did the grapevine work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, the first question is easy and won't even take 500 words. I don't know. Shmuel was not the same as his brothers. He didn't like the United States. He just didn't like it. It wasn't his kind of place. And 10 years later, when everybody else went, you see, he went, and there were a tenement. You know, here he came. I didn't hear something else about going back in person. When I went there, it's a beautiful, I mean, the town itself is a wasteland, but it's a beautiful, as my grandfather told me, it's a pre-Carpathian paradise. Forests, rivers, you know, it's beautiful. So I can imagine, it was the first time I understood that my relatives were country people. I always thought their natural habitat was the Lower East Side of Manhattan. No, but that's why you have to make these trips. And then I thought, of course he didn't like it. In his own town, people knew him, his family was known, it was beautiful, and I bet he thought, you know, why should I be in this horrible place? I'm going to make it, right? 10 years later was World War I had happened, the economy was destroyed, and they were younger, and I bet they had more spilkus, and they just thought, we got to get out of here, right? So that's one possible reason. Here's how the grapevine worked. When I came back from the first trip to Balakh, we, of course, made videotapes. And, of course, being Jaegers, we showed them to everyone we knew. And my mother sent a copy of the tape to my cousin Elkanah, she rests in peace, in Israel. And Elkanah, being a Jaeger, showed it to everyone in Israel, which is a lot easier to do than showing it to everyone in New York. And one of those people saw the tape, and he talked to someone who talked, you know, Israel has 37 people. And they said to someone, and one of them said, I think I know a guy from that same town. He lives in Australia. He sent him an email, and boom, that's how it happened.
Okay.
One more question.
First of all, I want to say that I was very impressed by your book.
Thank you.
I think it is 753 pages or something, small print. And I read it all very quickly.
I think you mean 267 pages.
No,
I'm kidding.
many more. No, I thought it was very impressive.
Thank
one
you.
thing, one comment I would like to make. You write very frankly about the people that you interview, about your brother. I remember mainly your brother, less your sister. Mm-hmm. And for me, I missed your own part in the story. I missed yourself. You are asking all the people, you tell very frankly what they say, etc. And I missed you a little bit in the story, and I thought that was a pity.
Well, it's
That's
not,
one thing.
and here's why. No, I know what you're talking about, and it's a question that comes up because, you see, right now in the States we have this huge trend of, you know, autofiction, right, memoir, blah, 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 and it tends to be of the, I was addicted to something and then I was cured and, you know. And I think it sort of you know, it's something I'm reacting against in the book, which is that I didn't want it to be a book about me. Everything in the book that you learn about me is only there because it helps you think about Shmuel, right? I wanted this to be a book about them. Yes, of course, I'm in it, I'm schlepping, I'm going, whatever, but I didn't want it to be a book. I didn't want, and this is connected to the same, you know, what I was talking about before about the culture of simulacrums and whatever. I didn't want everyone to say, oh, and in this book, he finds himself and I, you know, the Holocaust happened, so I should have my redemptive moment at the end of my book. But it sounds funny, but you'd be surprised how many books that happens in.
All on the theme, me and the Holocaust.
Yeah, right. And I
That's not really what I'm talking about.
Well, no, but so I kept myself very scrupulously out of the book, me, my personality, except when I thought it was helpful to think about the subject of the book. And, you know, I just, that was important to me. I thought that was part of the strictness that I was trying to enforce. And I should say that if you want to learn about me, buy my first book.
Okay, thank you very much. Here we close the presentation of the book and the discussion about it by thanking you most cordially for the openness in which you talked about yourself as the writer of the book.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mendelsohn, for your reading, and thank you, Mr. Zeeman, for moderating this evening. It's a great evening, I think, about storytelling, a thing we like to do at the John Adams Institute, and thank you for sharing your ideas behind the book with us. I would also like to thank the Arbeiderspers, and especially Ele Klettinga, who contacted me a year ago about this book, and it's great that it's now here tonight on sale in the Dutch translation. It's a beautiful edition, especially Mr. Zeeman is happy about the paper and the way it opens. It reads perfectly, huh? Okay. And I would like to thank, of course, Felix Maritis, my staff, Kobe Evans, and all the volunteers who helped out tonight. We are a non-profit organization, so if you're not a member yet, you can sign up tonight and become a member and join us at our upcoming lectures. We will have Graham in October. We will have Simon Shama in November. And we will have a special evening with Nigella Lawson in December. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you back